Thank you for joining us again at the Empowerment Roundtable. Again, my name is Magdalena Diaz, pronouns ella, she, her, hers. And I will have both of my colleagues introduce themselves. And then today we actually have a guest speaker, and we're super excited to have her here.
Aloha, everyone. My name is Tashaina Church, and I am she, her, hers. Happy to be here.
Hi, this is Reka, she, her, hers, and I'm also excited for today's roundtable.
Awesome. I'm Jennifer Ponce, pronouns she, her, hers, and I'm excited to be a guest.
Thank you, Jennifer. And I do want to give our audience, some information about you. So if you don't mind sharing maybe a little bit about your background and, your work in violence prevention and kind of how you got to this work.
Yeah, so I am currently the prevention education manager at a local domestic violence nonprofit, but my role is going to be changing here shortly. But I've been in the world of violence prevention probably, I would say, for the last 10 years, cumulatively, I can't even speak. But I started this work long time ago when I was actually my undergrad. My background is in public health and health education. And back then, I had a strong focus on violence prevention and gender-based violence. But at that time, it just really wasn't a thing. And so moving forward in my career and as things have come together, a lot of my work has really been focused on the prevention piece when it comes to violence and looking at generational links of trauma and violence, and even looking at the micro cause of violence within our family systems. And yeah, so that's where I come from.
Thank you. So today, during our roundtable, we're going to be discussing a few topics that we believe intersect. So one of them, again, all of us here come as practitioners, as advocates, as violence prevention educators, as healers. And that is really the focus. And we want to center the work that we do and the survivors that we work with. But one of the things that we do know to be true, and we can base it on statistics, but we can also base it on our own personal experiences, is that a lot of people that do this work have also experienced some type of trauma in their life. And that shouldn't be a surprise because, most women, unfortunately, have experienced at some level of sexual harassment, might it be catcalling, in their lifetime, right? So we all come with stories, and a lot of times what lead us to this work is our stories, either us directly being impacted, our family being impacted by these issues. But we found a gap, at least on a personal level, in regards to are we allowed to bring those identities together, right? Our identity as an activist, an advocate, an educator, facilitator, and as a survivor, and how do we merge those together to still honor the individuals that we're working with, but also honor ourselves and our healing. And because we also know that to be true, and we know that healing is not linear, how we've also might have experienced re-traumatization through either other individuals in the work, institutions, organizations, how that plays out in our life. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about. And because the current event that we're living in the United States, the conversation about what's happening and what we've heard in regards to politics and how that impacts our work and how we feel about being political while we're doing this work, and sometimes having restrictions on what we can speak on and what we cannot. So that's kind of our topic. So we'll just kind of like open it up. I don't know, Jennifer, like your thoughts on like, what does that look like for you? How to like your experiences as a professional and your own personal experiences and how you merge them, or what barriers you've encountered.
I love it. I love all the topics that you just lifted up, and the chance that we have and a privilege that we have to be able to have even this conversation. And I think one of the biggest things that I've learned in my advocacy, because I've even seen that morph over the years, is the concept and principle that two truths can be true at once. And I think even for me in my own role as a preventionist, one, and as an advocate in the world of intimate partner violence prevention, I found myself in that space with a very abusive spouse. And during that time, I felt like that identity, had that been known, would have completely eliminated my professionalism, everything that I brought to the table, my credibility in this work as a preventionist when it comes to domestic violence prevention. And I know that I shared this with you, Magdalena, but that was something I struggled with because I was tasked with being in the community, educating law enforcement officers, educating other community-based organizations. Any resource that I would have accessed, I felt like I had zero access to because I was like, who am I going to call? The cops that I was just training and I was just at their briefing. And who am I going to meet with? The therapist who's also my colleague? Like, I felt like I had no one, like absolutely no one. And I feel like that's a conversation that is definitely lacking within our professional spaces, within our advocacy, within our organizations, and just saying, like, it is okay. And it wasn't until I finally was like, okay, enough is enough. And, having babies myself, I'm like, at some point, this has to stop. It wasn't until I was in that place that finally I found safe people that I could talk to. And it wasn't until I was willing and able to be vulnerable that I was met with compassion that I didn't even know existed. And I can't help but think if we were able to show up for others and just let them know and almost give them permission to accept both identities and know that resources are available no matter what, and realizing that, yeah, even though we're professionals, we're also human, and it doesn't make us immune to that imbalance of power and control, right? Because that's what violence is, that's what oppression is. And I'm a big believer that there is absolutely zero way to do anti-violence work without doing anti-oppression work, because that's what it comes down to. And what you were mentioning early, Magdalena, like I've seen that definitely even in our nonprofit sectors, seeing that same imbalance of power. And there's still someone who is utilizing a lot more power, and some of the terms that you've used, exploitation and, just oppressive, coercive ways to get the work done and to move it forward. I feel like honoring our identities is so important and impactful in helping us sort of take that power back to help us do the effective work that we actually need to do.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. And I know I'll open it up because I think this resonates with all of us. And I mean, I have a lot to say, but we've had these conversations, but I want to open it up to like everyone else in regards to, again, thank you for sharing your story and your experience. But how does that resonate with everyone else?
Well, yeah, I mean, gosh, Jennifer, first, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your story. It's very impactful, and it's so interesting, right? I was in Washington State, and I ran a program on empowerment. And I worked in schools. I worked with middle school and high school girls on self-esteem, body image, and self-defense training. And I was in a very emotionally abusive relationship, both with my significant other and intimate partner, and then also with my business partner, who, for her, I know that she was struggling. She was dealing with an unhappy marriage, but basically it was like verbal vomiting. And then lots of, like, if she was having a bad day, there would just be rage. And then it was this blank, like, oh, but why do you not want to talk to me right now? What's going on? And so it was really interesting to be teaching empowerment, to try and utilize all of these years of knowledge and skill, and what to say, what to do, how to teach, and yet you are dealing with these very disempowering situations behind closed doors, and you want to be able to get support, but then you do have these thoughts: am I going to still be seen as credible? Will people still take me seriously? And so for me, I was very silent during that time. I remember I had I had a book that I published, and the week before my book launch, I actually had an attempted sexual assault. And so not only dealing with my issue with my partner, my issue with my relationship, but then this attempted sexual assault. But that was actually the spearhead to me making these decisions of, I don't want to live this way anymore. I don't want to have to deal with this. It's too much to be in this situation where I have no one to speak to. And I feel completely alone. So I ended up going in and going into a domestic violence support center that had therapists there who were able to help me, and that was the road to healing. But I think that, you know, for me, I was, you know, I had all these people who wanted to support me. I just didn't feel safe being able to share, because then that would expose the people who I was working with, or it would expose, you know, the people who I was in partnership with, and something in me wanted to protect that image, or protect, you know, the idea of what it was, when really there are so many different layers. So I think as practitioners, and as people who are in these really awesome power positions doing really credible work, it is really important for us to be able to be authentic and share and be real, because we are going through it, and that adds to the experience, that adds to the credibility. It also allows others to feel emboldened and empowered to be able to say, this is happening to me too. So yeah, so that's for me, you know, just a background. But it's, I think that it is wonderful that we do have this space where we are able to share, and we can actually come out and have all of this support, because this, you know, this is just ongoing healing. I don't think that healing just stops one day, and then suddenly on that day you are prepared to teach, or you are prepared to deliver as a leader, or take on a leadership role. So I think that, you know, it's a lifelong learning experience. We are going to have things come up in our life, and we're going to have to work with those. I had an experience last week where I was followed. So I had to use all of the skills that I was taught, and it was great. And it definitely had these things that came up for me emotionally, where I had to do a lot of self-care. Um, but I also think that it was really awesome for me to be able to experience that, be able to share, yes, I used all of the skills, they work, yay. And let's keep on going forward. So yeah, so that for me has been an interesting journey of just continually growing, continually being able to help my community. And I love it. I think it's great.
Yeah, Jen, I just would like to add that thank you so much. I think you expressed really well what our purpose is with this roundtable, and many things you said resonated with me as well. Me being a practitioner and a peace builder and a student of psychology and a mediator, I help people all the time, like professionally and in my personal life too. They just reach out to me for help, and then I'm able to like give them like resources, like this is where you can turn to if you need help in this and this area and so on, whether that be domestic violence or birth trauma or conflict or all kinds of things. But many times I feel like I have no access to those resources. And yeah, and you just worded it so well that many practitioners struggle with that. And I love that you mentioned vulnerability, that when you became vulnerable about your situation, then I'm sorry, correct me if I remember this wrong, but you mentioned something about vulnerability, and vulnerability helped you to get help in your situation. And I think that's a key thing that's so important, because I feel like many times when I feel like I don't have access to those resources, it's because I feel some kind of shame that I'm doing this work, and I know all these resources. I know where people should turn to if they deal with this and this problem, and I still don't do it because I feel ashamed that as a practitioner, I struggle with many similar things. So thank you so much for wording that and sharing your experience.
Yeah, thank you, Jen. Again, I agree with all of you. I think that there's so many great things that come up right for me when I hear Jen and I hear everyone else talk. I think the realization, right, that we always talk about demystifying or the stigma, no more stigma around dating, domestic violence, gender-based violence, right? Like that is like the bulk of our work, but within our own communities, it's still very much taboo, right? I mean, it's this conversation I've had with you, Jen, right? Like multiple times. I've had with multiple people in this field, right? Like I know with some of my friends and colleagues, we actually sit down, right? And we're like, I've thought about it. What if this, if I was walking late at night and something happened to me, right? Who would I call? Because if I call the local, like Jen, like you were mentioning, like the local agency to get maybe a SART exam, um, you know, the advocate that would come in is an advocate that I go to meetings every month, right? Or I work on a college campus. If I needed accesses on campus, the advocate would be the person that I work with directly, right? Um, and I think it also, I mean, I as you all know, I am really interested in decolonizing all of this work. I think it also goes back to this idea of professionalism, right? What is professional? And I think we put that as well as a blinder, like that is not professional for me to have experienced this. And I know, like myself, in the unlearning that I'm doing, I've also caused harm to some of the my colleagues in regards to what my expectations are of them, because that's what the professional thing to do, right? And really dismissing a lot of times that they were in need, right? Like they were experiencing something, and maybe that's why they were not fully showing up to, to our meetings or our work. And just like how I can do that if I'm working with a survivor and they're not fully invested, like I don't automatically think, oh, they don't want my help, right? I have the tools to say, I understand this because this person is just overwhelmed, right? Or they're experiencing trauma, so they are not here because they have all these other things happening. Excuse me. So it's interesting that I can do that with like a client, let's call them. But if it's someone that I'm working with, like a colleague, that I completely dismiss that, and I just assume they're just not being professional, and not think like maybe they're not showing up because they're going through stuff. Sorry, I need some water. So I think it's really interesting how it's been so embedded in us that we have to separate those two things, that even when we're working with our colleagues, we only see them from that professional lens and not really like humans that can experience things and might be going through stuff. So that really resonated with me. I think one thing that made me really realize, how people perceive me, because when I started doing this work, the way I was trained was, you never talk about yourself, right? You never bring up your own experiences. When you're in here, you're an advocate. I mean, it was things like, even like if they ask you to have children, don't answer that. If they ask you if you're married, don't answer that. And I mean, I truly believe that at the time, like that was what the professional thing to do was, right? And then I had this moment with, I was working with a survivor, and we were in a support group setting, and we were just kind of hanging out, and we were talking about something about life, and how like life, a lot of times when you're experiencing um difficult situations, you'll get like these little pockets of like sun, like where you can just cry, right? And people don't ask you why, right? And like it's just like these moments that you get in life when you're really overwhelmed and you can just fall apart and people won't question you, right? And they were sharing the story about how someone had had a really bad day, and but they felt like they just didn't have the capacity to like break down because they didn't want to be answering questions. And someone showed up, and like, their puppy was sick or something like that, and so that person started crying over the puppy. And the owner of the puppy, I was like, okay, I didn't know you care so much about my puppy, right? But the person was, I mean, she felt bad for the puppy, but in reality she was like, that was my moment, right? To be able to just cry and people wouldn't question me or ask me, right? And I remember, like, again, I'm sitting here with survivors and me as a facilitator, right, in that role. I'm really trying to open up. And I was just like, not even thinking about it. I was like, oh my God, I just had one of those last week, right? I'm like, I was really overwhelmed. I can't even remember why. And I had a dentist appointment in the middle of the work day. And I went to the dentist, and because I was in physical pain because of the dentist, I just started crying. And I didn't understand why I was crying at the moment. Um, and obviously the dentist didn't question me, right? Because he thought I was in pain. So he was like, okay, you can cry. Um, and I'm like, and it's such a relief, right? I was just able to let go of everything. No one asked me questions. And then I was able to move on with my day. And I remember one of the survivors looked at me and she's like, oh my God, you cry? And I was so shocked by that. I was like, what do you mean? She's like, you cry. And I'm like, yeah, I cry every day. Right. And that really was the epiphany for me to see how a lot of the people we work with don't see us as humans because they put all these restrictions around who we can be as a professional. And am I really empowering people if I'm making it into like a binary of like, look at me, I have my life together and I don't cry, and look at you and all the stuff that you experience, right? And I think that was really what when it clicked for me, and a lot of the unlearning around this work and owning who I am, all the identities that I come in with, when I do this work, because that was really heartbreaking to me that this individual thought that I didn't cry. And I was like, I cry. Like I've experienced things in my life, right? And that's why I can understand you. And I think it also is empowering to know that even people that you think again have their life together, we've been through things. And that's the beauty of life, right? That we can grow from things, we can heal, we can learn to turn those things into something that then fulfills. I mean, it's very fulfilling, right? To like, I turned this something that could have been really bad in my life into something wonderful. Um, so yeah, so to me, again, Jennifer and I have had this conversation so many times about like the taboo around it, right? Like, who do we talk to, who do we reach out to, but even with the people that we work with, how do they view us? And how, again, we always tell people like these things can happen to anyone, but we never say these things can happen to anyone, and it can also happen to me, and it can happen to, your therapist, your advocate. Like, it can happen to anyone.
I would just like to add, like, I so appreciate you stating that, Maggie, because it's so true. And I can say, like, as I mentioned, I went on and got my master in social work because I was like, you know what? No, like there's so much more to the story when it comes to prevention and preventing these things and the work that we do. And one of the key pillars or something that's like always said is you're meeting your client, you're meeting the individual where they are. But how often are we not even meeting ourselves where we are? So I really love that you shared that, because that is something. I also serve on the board of directors for the California Partnership to End Domestic Violence. So my two main loves, one is prevention and two is policy. Like, I absolutely love policy and social change at that level. And I will say that that is something that even the partnership has said, like, we do not have enough survivor voices in this space. And initially, way early on, back historically, when it was like battered women, and which has so many issues even around that movement, right? Because it's very, when we talk about colonization, very white centered, very different. But even back then, that voice was welcomed into that space. And they were saying, as more and more of the work has become more business like, we've eliminated that voice because we've glommed on to professionalism. We've glommed on to these theories and these models that are more like businesses, and so they've erased that, and the erasure of using that voice. And now that we've been able to progress the work so much further and learn about diversity and inclusivity and response and being trauma informed, now we're not even including the most vulnerable and most important voice that's there. And I can't only help to think back, and I'm very open about experiencing sexual assault when I was very young in college and what that experience was like. And how I love how you mentioned, Tasha, like, it's like I can remember even with my own aggressor, like, still in that element of trying to protect them, because later on I discovered that was me trying to protect me, because if I gave them the label of as my aggressor, then that meant now I own the label of victim, and I wasn't ready to have that as a label or even start that path or go there with myself at that time. But I'm a very big on making sure that people assign the labels that they are ready to own when they're ready to own them, because language, it's so important, because language can be traumatic in and of itself. It can be healing or it can be harming. And I feel like in this space, because we have that lack of survivor voices, I think that that is something that we glom onto. We just like to assign and we like to assume, and we do all of this stuff that's just very rote and very prescribed, but it's really not, victim centered or client centered. And it's still very much coming from this lens of like, it looks like this when it really doesn't. I love how something Magdalena always mentions, and I love that, is that as humans, we are so complex. And of course, like, our healing is a journey, and no two lives look the same. But I can say that when I was ready to finally like get help and talk to someone, it's because someone else said I had been there, and I didn't even feel comfortable or safe until I met another voice that said, like, I have been there, I understand, this happened to me. Then finally it's like it started to strip away the, okay, wait a minute, there's shame and guilt because this only happened to me. It's like, no, this is happening elsewhere. And that I feel like just that in and of itself is really like what opened the door. And I hope to see more of that too.
Yeah, and I think, one thing that really is, I just need to like name it, because like, again, we talk about I'm the same. I think language is so powerful for healing, but I think it's all, for me personally, it's also the root of a lot of violence, right? With language, we can be violent and also create spaces where violence can exist, right? And especially with social media, I know we've had that conversation. That could be a whole other thing, right? With like how with language we can create spaces where violence can occur. So language, I think, is it's a key component, right? But so I need to call what you, like something that you said, right, in regards to when we're talking about like organizations that say like we don't have enough voices of survivors, right? I compare that to what's happening in the Latinx community at the moment. There's been a lot of a call in for Latinx folks in regards to our anti-Blackness and owning our anti-Blackness within our own communities. And even like I've been guilty of this, like when I've like protested or gone to marches saying like, Latinx for Black lives, right? And someone said like, you're erasing that there's Black Latinx folks when you're saying that, right? You're saying like only like there's not Latinx are not Black, right? And you're erasing a whole group of people, right? So there's been a calling for Latinx folks to say, stop saying things like, Latinx or for Black lives, because there are Black Latinx folks. And how does that make Black Latinx feel excluded, right? Like, I'm not Latinx, I'm not Black, like, where do I fit? So what you said, I compare it to that, because you say like, a lot of these organizations, a lot of boards saying like, we are missing out the voices of survivors. And in that, they're erasing that our identity as survivors, if we're there as a professional, as an expert. Because if I'm sitting in a room with all these professionals and they say that, at that moment, what does that say to me, right? Like, what do those words say to me? And more than likely, I mean, if it's someone that's in the moment, in the midst, experiencing, dating violence, domestic violence, sexual violence, and that's said to them, it again reinforces that, oh, I don't get to be a survivor in this place. I am here as a professional, as an expert. It's like, well, why can't, instead of saying like we're, the voices of survivors are not, we're not, we need more, why are we not saying like, who do we have here that can, have that duality of being a practitioner and also a survivor?
I think that it's, so it's really interesting. I'm listening to what you're saying. It's such a delicate thing to actually bring up as a facilitator, to have this kind of conversation and, and open up the space and have people who want to come forward, and as a person of color, you have to be very delicate if you or even if you're a white person and you're facilitating something, you definitely have to be very delicate when you are bringing it up and offering an open space for people to speak. I've had people who are facilitating, and especially with Black Lives Matter movement and everything else coming forward, I've had white facilitators who have said, okay, we're ready to listen. Who would like to speak? What person of color would like to speak? And that's just, there are certain ways of going about it, but it's not necessarily that person's job. And when it comes to teaching white people about race or something along those lines, it's not the person of color's job to teach white people how to understand what they're going through. Just like it's not, it is not my job as a woman to continually educate a man about these gender-based violence issues. It is important for men to take up these roles, to be able to teach, their counterparts, other men, young boys, about what's happening, so there can be preventative action. But it is interesting. The other piece that was resonating with me, I was just, with what's been happening, a lot of people, there's so much coming up for people right now, especially with the election and everything. You have this person who is just very angry, has lots of rage, has notably, 45, something along those lines, rape cases that have come up in the span of their public life. That can be very triggering for a lot of different women. So I know that, especially with the election, tensions have been high and people have been sharing their stories. And I know that there was another practitioner who actually opened up and shared some different stuff that had happened, that, a realization that, wow, I have a lot of healing that needs to be done. I have a lot that's going on, and just shared. And it was really interesting because I had to check myself and my bias, because my first initial thought was like, oh, I, you know, I didn't know that you were going through this stuff. And so, what are we doing to each other? How are we supporting each other? How can we show up for each other as sisters in this work? As other practitioners, doesn't necessarily have to be just all women, but how can we support one another so that we have these safe spaces for people, for women and men and other, so that all of us can heal. And I love, that's why I love the Empowerment Roundtable, is because we have this opportunity to be able to be very open, be very vulnerable, be very real. Reika, I don't know if you had any points on that, but that was just my thinking. Is this last week, so many things of different emotions have come up, and I know that those were some different thoughts that I had.
Yeah, just connecting it to the current events and the elections. It's very interesting. So when the whole thing, well, some people say it's not over yet, but on Saturday they basically announced that, like, that Joe Biden will be the president and Kamala Harris the vice president, and Trump is leaving his office. So that was, I I felt like that was the official thing on Saturday. And I observe a lot of things on social media and from what I talk with my friends, and so many people just said that they feel so relieved and they feel like they can breathe again. So that was something I noticed in people's narratives. And so yeah, so I don't know how the next 4 years will be, but there is definitely a lot of healing which is needed, a lot of, like, giving some space for people sharing their narratives, their stories. And some people said that they felt like for the first time ever after 4 years they can open up and speak up about their experiences and how they felt oppressed, um, and really just what was it like for them these past few years, and what are they hoping it will change. And I think yeah, that's just very interesting, how many things can happen in a few years, which make people feel like that. And we just need to listen to the stories of these people, and even those who supported Trump. um, I invited them to just, like, right now, just like at least acknowledge the stories of the people who felt traumatized or felt activated or hurt during this his presidency, because that's their reality, and we need to listen to those experiences. And I'm so glad people are opening up now. Yeah, and it's sad that that many people felt like they couldn't in the past 4 years, and this was their first time where they could breathe again. So yeah, so these are just my thoughts connecting to the current events. What do you all think about this?
Yeah, I think that even, the whole idea of, being political, I mean, again, like my existence is political by being, me, like a woman of color, my experiences. And it's been very interesting. Again, I am Latinx. So I've seen a lot of, and, Latinx folk, like women and men and folks just in general, support Trump, right? For different reasons that they have, right? And they claim that they are not political or don't like talking about politics, which it blows my mind, right, all the time, because I'm like, your existence is political, right? Like there's decisions being made in the Supreme Court, right, about you and what you can and cannot do. So it's been interesting on that lens and on the race, right? Because I mean, we on our last episode we talked about like our where we're standing, what our thoughts are on our lenses, and we talked about being intersectional. So on the race issue, right? Like, what does it mean to talk about someone that has said these things, right? About my race, right? And how do I separate that, right? And still vote for him or still, look at him one way. And because I do like to be, I think in order for us to heal, we have to hold everyone accountable, ourselves including, right? I think a lot of the things that I've heard regarding like, Biden as well, and, the allegations he has, and people using that as like their way of getting back at you, right? Like, well, he has done this, right? So you must support, this behavior. As someone that does this work and that has experiences and has family experience certain situations, that's also very triggering. Yeah, it sucks that we live in a world where we have to pick between two people that have allegations against them. So it's not even just about Trump, right? It's about Biden as well. And I know there's been a lot of conversation regard like a lot of survivor advocacy work and activist work that has had conversations about like, how do survivors feel when on the ballot they're literally picking from like two people that have had these allegations against them. So I think that's also something that people forget and can be very activating or re-traumatizing when you're trying to have these conversations and people will say like, well, you must support this, right? And I'm just like, you don't know my story, right? um, and I mean, I talked about it more on the lens of immigration, also being formally undocumented, when people have said things like, well, this administration is separating children to save them from human trafficking. And as someone that actually, came here as a child and had that experience of coming in with my parents, undocumented, um, having people negate your experience and then turn it into like this political gimmick is very triggering. Like a lot of the things that I had worked through in regards to being a child, a migrant child, and what that meant really came up for me during this election. And seeing how people like really twisted it, because it's like I know what it actually is. I mean, to be detained as a child and for people to say that it's something else, because this is what's being told to them, just so they, to claim that one political party is doing one thing over the other. Yeah, it can be very difficult, and I think it's really hard to do this work and not be political, right? Or stay quiet, when we know that a lot of these things impact not just on a personal level, but on a professional level, right? I know Jen, your new role is in the Department of Education. I mean, Tasha, you work in education, so it's not just about Trump. It's this whole administration and how who goes is elected impacts the work that we do. And so how can you stay quiet, or how do you navigate when you are restricted on what you can say, or when you don't feel supported by your employer or the organizations that you're a part of when they're not speaking up against these issues?
Oh, absolutely. I would say one thing from this election that I know a lot of people have lifted this up as well. And I just want to say also thank you, Magdalena, for bringing. I never even considered that about that the survivorship and inviting those in the spaces and what the implication is for the advocate. Like I'd never even considered that before. And I think the same goes for the election. I think the first thought that I had is like, yeah, this is great. There's a sigh of relief, and it's more so what Trump stands for and a lot of these policies and these systems, but to me it was like, oh wow, like the simple fact that it was so close, I'm like, how much work has to be done, and why are we not looking at that as a whole, as to there's still a huge portion of our population that believes in these things and that still want to uphold this. I heard someone on the news say this and I'm like, what are you talking about? But they said, the support, people who do support Trump or might support this type of policy or whatever, they're trying to uphold an America that they feel we lost. And my first thought with that, I'm like, that's an America that was non-existent. Like that was completely a false narrative built on the back of oppression and everything that a lot of people have experienced. And same, um it's I mean, there's a lot I could say about that, like the trying to stay apolitical. I know in some of the places where I'll just be transparent, where I work, seeing them try to stay apolitical, it's impossible. And the same thing, to not talk about oppression and to not talk about racism, to not, and they're trying to use certain other movements as like the erasure of Black Lives Matter, for instance. Like that to me is just very disheartening and just tells me like there's so much work for us to do.
Yeah. Jennifer, you're talking about this, and I'm just thinking it is really important to recognize the intersectionalities when it comes to different issues, whether it's gender-based violence, racial violence, or prejudice. It's really important for us to be able to acknowledge those, but then not try and say one is better than the other, more important than the other, and discount, the experience. Reka, did you have something that you wanted to share with it?
Sorry, what was your last sentence?
So I was just talking about the intersectionalities between these different experiences. Immigration is one really big experience that a lot of people have to, are dealing with. And when it came to the election, I know that was a huge motivator for a lot of people on both sides. One is save the children, and this idea of saving these children who are being separated from their parents. And then on the other side, you have these people who are actually in the work, who are focused on human trafficking, who are focused on immigration. And that's something that's completely different. So just recognizing all of these different issues as to why people chose to vote the way that they did,
Yeah, totally. And we discussed this before, that many of these are politically motivated narratives. Sorry, I don't know why the picture is so weird. Sorry. So why these are like politically motivated narratives about save the children, and then about the nature of human trafficking. So we just discussed this before, that these been highly politicized, and we talked about abortion as well in our last episode. So yeah, um, yeah, we just need to be mindful of these things, and what can be, and why are these the narratives which are surrounding right now influencing people who to support. And I just would like to go back to what Jen said just for a second, of like, it can really be traumatizing for people to see these leaders in power, whether that be Trump or Biden, and knowing that both of them have allegations towards them, of sexual assault and other things. And it is truly sad that these are the choices in today's world what we choose from. Like we know that in most countries we have male leadership, and I know in my country our leader, and in many other countries as well, they have similar issues as well. But these are the choices we can make, we can choose from. And we just need to be mindful how it can be really traumatizing for so many people, seeing these powerful leaders, these powerful men on the top leading countries, but knowing that they cause some kind of individual or collective harm towards people. So it's just good to recognize that.
Yeah, and I think the important thing in regards to like, I mean, because politics is, you know, anything we can talk about, and not just in the United States, but all over the world, right? Like the state of the United States is the hot topic. And you know, we have this issue of like having individuals that have been accused of sexual violence, of gender-based violence. You know, and then again, the duality of things. And again, I center a lot of like my lens, like, or at least the lenses that I see things through. And you know, I'm a huge proponent of transformative justice, because this idea of people, I mean, Jen, you mentioned, like, I always say this, like, we are complex, right? Like, as human beings, like, we hold good and bad and in between, right? There's no all good or all bad. um and we see things like, you know, someone like Joe Biden that has these allegations against him, right? And I mean, again, as people that practitioners and people in the anti-violence work, we want to make sure that those things are heard, and if people need to be held accountable. But we also know that he's done a lot of, you know, he's pushed a lot for survivor rights, right? And is really involved in, you know, in education and just general like rights of survivors. And the, you know, that gets difficult. We're complex people, right? And I mean, when we think of harm doers, one of the main reasons that both Tasha and Jen brought up, like this wanting to protect that individual, because we know those individuals as complex human beings. We don't not just know the bad in them, we also know the good in them. And that's why it's such a hard thing to do, right? Um, so it's difficult to look at it and really dissect like all the things that people have done, and the good that they've done and the bad that they've done. I think the other reason why it's, even though this is something, again, because of who I am and how these experiences impact me as a woman of color, as a, you know, a migrant, as, you know, so many identities that I hold, is that, you know, I do want to be political and I want to speak up and I want to say what I have to say. But because of the role that we a lot of times hold, we have to be mindful. Jen mentioned, right? She has to work with law enforcement. So what is she able to say and not say? Because ultimately, if, you know, we say things that, you know, people don't like, how does that impact our relationship with them? But also, like, to, again, in my role as an advocate, it was always thinking about like, how does my behavior impact how survivors are going to access services, right? Is me saying something, is me being rude to an officer because I didn't like the way they handle something, is that going to then long term impact the services survivors have? um, so I think, again, going back to like how difficult it is to hold your identity as a survivor and as a practitioner, how difficult it is to be political when a lot of times you have to work within these systems, right? And you still have to navigate them, and not just for yourself, but for the people that you're trying to support.
So, Magdalena, you were bringing up a kind of an interesting point, and I think everyone has touched on it. All of us are so complex, and you know, we might have a bad day that might shape how someone sees us. We might make decisions that, at the time, you know, in hindsight, you look back and you think, "Gosh, I wish I made a different decision." I think that people are constantly evolving and growing. And I do believe that it is really important for people to do this process. And so, you know, I see the allegations and different stuff that comes up, and based off of my decision when I chose to vote, it was really important for me to vote based off of my own interests, despite the fact that I knew that there are two people who each have allegations against them. And the hope for me was me looking at these people and seeing who would be willing to do their own work and who would be willing to elevate themselves to a different level when it came to if they had anger management issues, which that's something that has been brought up. If they have a past history against women, what are they going to do to change that behavior? Because I think we have this idea, especially with growing up with Disney, where there's a good person, there's a bad person, that's it. But there's so many different layers, and all of us have had these moments, and some people have experienced unsavory moments, and they react and they respond. I know that I've had my bad days, and I've done all I can to be a good person, do the right thing, put my best foot forward. As a survivor, I think that I had so many years where I didn't feel comfortable sharing. And because of that bottling up, I took that out in different ways. And, I know that at some point this will come up with conversations later, but I know that my experience with my family, who tried to reach out, tried to support me, wanted to help me, I was very angry and I pushed them away. And that was a negative behavior. So, I think that as we go through, as we're doing this work, it is important for people to understand that we are human. We're not superhuman people. We're not superheroes. But we also, as humans, are still qualified to do the work, are still capable. And our stories are also what bring us strength, what bring us power, and what bring us experience to be able to relate to our clients in a way that someone who has not had these experiences cannot. So I think that that's also something that's very important to note. I've had martial artists male martial artists who have said that, oh, I would do this, I would do that, all of these different things, and talk about their qualifications. And I'm like, have you ever been raped before? Do you know what that's like? Do you know what the aftermath is? Do you know what the experience is coming back? This is something that I have as an experience that I can understand and relate to my clients. And it's a way for them to be able to relate to me and know that they're in the hands of somebody who is able to understand what that plight is and understand how to get out of it. So yeah, Magdalena, you were going to say something.
Yeah, no, I mean, there again, we can go on right on this topic forever, I feel, because it's so complex. But I just wanted to say, Tasha, that I agree in regards to the complexity of a human being, right? I always joke with individuals that I say, for someone, I might be the nice, like someone that I've supported through a process, right? Or, through their survivorship, they might see me as the best person in the world, right? As a saint. And that could be true, right? And I could also be that person that after a really long day, being stressed, go to Target, and I go off on a cashier because I'm just so stressed, and that cashier now thinks I'm the worst human being in the world, right? Those two things are true because again, there's so many layers, right? And it's not all good or bad. And it's really understanding that, not just for survivors, but also for the harm doers, right? Like, what does that look like? So thank you again. I think just to wrap it up, I do want to maybe leave with, I think one of the biggest reasons why we wanted to talk about this is, again, how do we support survivors in the work, right? So if there's any like one or two things that you think can bridge that gap between being a practitioner and also being a survivor, what is it that you think we need to do in this work to bridge that gap?
Honestly, I think that just making sure that we're checking ourselves. I think that's huge in and of itself. Like seeing where we're at, seeing how we're feeling, seeing if we're not, inviting both identities you said into that space. Why? What's set up? What's making me feel that way? And I think that just the more that we are kind of aware of ourselves and our work, that's the best way that we can show up for the people that we're working with, even in whatever role.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. We mentioned that we Tasha shared. Oh no, it was you, Magdalena. You shared something with us this morning about President Biden's new task force on online harassment. Oh, oh, and abuse. Oh, I'm sorry. There's sorry. Can you grab her for a second too? Sorry. Yeah. So one hopeful step in a good direction, hopefully, we see is President Biden started this new task force on online harassment and abuse to focus on the connection between mass shootings, online harassment, extremism, and violence against women. So, what I don't know, just to I guess we're wrapping up soon. So, what you all think about this? This seems promising. So I hope they will go through with it.
Yeah, I think it's important. I think that these issues, again, we go from a administration that completely, wasn't really giving the attention, the funding needed for these issues, to this new administration that really has a focus on, gender-based violence and violence against women. And I think, especially with COVID, the reality, and again, that could be a whole other section in regards to technology abuse and empowerment online, right? How do we empower individuals to be safe, especially with COVID? That people have that everything we're doing is online. um, that's one layer, but the other layer is that people are also stuck at home with harm doers, right? They can't get away, and what does that look like? So really, this task force hopefully will help in addressing that and really bringing to light the connections. And again, that's we everything we talk about feel could be a whole topic in itself, because something that I also find a lot of interest in is the connection between mass shooting, murder, suicide, and intimate partner violence, and how we're not talking about it as intimate partner violence. We talk about it as, mass shooting or murder suicide. But there's been in the past years a lot of mass shooting that, is, if you read after the headline, right, and you're reading in probably like a few paragraphs down, it'll say like, oh, and that person, they used to date, right, and he was going to school because they had just broken up, or he had felt rejected, and it gets lost, and there's that connection, right? And even with, again, with murder suicide, like, they will mention domestic violence, right? Maybe they will, but it will also be lost in everything else. I've always been a proponent to, like, call it what it is. Domestic violence occurred, right? Because that's what it is. And I think that also helps take away the stigma around these issues.
So we've jumped to a couple of different areas. I do want to touch on each. I know that with Biden's I can't even speak right now. With Biden's new task force, there's lots of hope, I think, for a lot of women who haven't had hope for a very long time. Me as a survivor, it has been very hard for the past 4 years to be able to watch someone who knowingly has disregarded women, treated them in a certain way very negatively and violently. And so there's hope that with this new administration, that lots of things will come. When it comes to the mass shootings and everything else, I think that it is really important for us to find these connections, because that is going to lead to solutions and hope. And we need to be able to find these connections and correlate them so that we can do preventative action and preventative work in our respective positions as we get into more and more leadership roles. When it comes to the self-care piece and what we can do as practitioners to support other practitioners, something for me, I am an extremely competitive person. I have had to check myself because, when there are these people who are killing it out there, I'm like, I need to be killing it. I need to be doing this. I need to be doing that. For me, what I have done to check myself and support women, because it is very important for all of us to be supporting each other in this work. If you are doing this work and in a leadership role, instead of being like, yeah, I got to take down this person, this is my competition, this is, this is this, it's just like, no, we got to help each other. If this person is doing something and they are killing it, how is how is the work different so that you can support that person? With ESD, they are putting out an online course. I'm going to be putting out an online course. For me, I want to be able to still promote their online course and say they are killing it. This is what they're doing. So even in my online course, I'm doing a little overview of ESD. What is ESD? If you want more information on ESD, because I'm doing empowerment self-defense, but I'm doing a very specific part with mine that's separate. So I know that my course is going to be different than theirs. I'm going to have a link to their course and say, you know what, they are doing amazing work. If you would like more information about their stuff, here it is. For me, I'm always trying to highlight what different organizations are doing, and say, if you would like more work, if you'd like more work in specifically protester safety, this is my recommendation. If you're doing more work in domestic violence, if you're doing more work in realtor safety, runner safety, like I do all of these things, but I know people who do these things full time, and I want to be able to highlight what they're doing and say they are killing it. If I'm not available, this is your resource. So we need to level up, elevate each other, promote each other, and really support each other in being vulnerable, because this is hard work. We are dealing with a lot, and stuff is coming up, and we are human. We are not superpowers. I have a client who calls me Superwoman or Wonder Woman all the time, and I'm like, yes, and I am still human. So thank you, ladies, so much. I think you're awesome. Magdalena, take it away.
Yeah, I just wanted to say again, I think in regards to that bridging that gap, I think being authentic, right? And part of that is decolonizing professionalism and
Yes.
what it means to show up fully to work, right? I want to be able to show up fully to my job without fear that, people are going to see me a certain way. So to me, I think, again, being authentic and being able to decolonize a lot of these ideas, even like, I attended today, Jennifer facilitated an amazing workshop, and they talked even about like decolonizing, or like, who's telling us what's healthy and unhealthy, right? What lens are we using to say that is an unhealthy relationship? So I think decolonizing, being authentic, and just really being open. I think a lot of the conversations and a lot of these amazing projects where we've been able to bond and really talk about like we have the same experiences has been in being open, right? With who we are. And like Jen mentioned earlier, like she had the best people around her that could support her. And she felt like for some reason she felt like people weren't going to support her. And when she did, like all these people were like, yeah, we're here for you. So again, reminding us like we have all these people around us, right? But sometimes we don't say that to each other. We don't say like, hey, I'm here. And we can do that verbally, we can do that, through actions. I know for me it's really important to have these conversations that before were deemed unprofessional, because I think it empowers individuals to make the choices that they need to do to be safe and live a life free of violence. I talk about wages, right? Which again, before we like don't ever talk about how much money you make, right? That's unprofessional. I mean, financial abuse exists in what is like 90 something percent of intimate partner violence. And a lot of people get stuck in the cycle of violence, even doing this work, right? Might be an unhealthy relationship, abusive relationship because of money, because we can't talk about money. And so I'm very open now about those things with other women, with other folks in this work. Hey, this is how much you should be getting. Like, let's talk about it. Let's get together. So not just on a one-on-one level, but on a systemic level, really make those changes that we need to be able to, again, live a free life and free of violence and healthy, and fulfill what we need, which is do the work, but also still live an equitable life. So that's what I think, what I would want to put into place to continue moving forward with this conversation and bridging that gap. But thank you again. I really appreciate everyone being here. Again, we can go on for hours probably about this. It's always hard to kind of like try to stick to a time. But I appreciate everyone. And, I look forward to seeing you all at the next roundtable.
Thank you. Aloha.
Thank
Thank you for
you.
having
Thank you,
me.
Jen.
Thank
Thank you, Jen.
you.
Thank you, everyone.